Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Jonathan Earl. I'm interim director here at the Dole Institute. I'm also a professor in the history department. And I can say this from experience. Historians love lists and rankings. Maybe that's why so many of us are also baseball fans. You wouldn't believe how many tipsy conversations at historians' conventions turn on whether Willie Mays was a better outfielder than Carlos Beltran. We also like to rank presidents. You might have seen a well-publicized article on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine by my dissertation advisor at Princeton, ranking our current commander-in-chief, well, last. As in worse than James Buchanan. I cannot agree with this. I fight with him on this as much as I can. If you look at the history of presidential rankings by historians or by average Americans, there are some obvious certainties. Unless you look at one made by libertarians who rank leaders in order of how much, during their time in office, the federal budget expanded, Abraham Lincoln does very well. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, in that libertarian one, is last. He's number 43. Our worst president. I kind of like Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, exactly. Libertarians can't abide that. You know, Lincoln does well, so does George Washington, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, and Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, as does James K. Polk. But if you ever want to know about why that's true, you can come find me after a presentation. There's a whole lot of moving around. There's not a whole lot of moving around among people who are ranked highly in the presidential ranking system by historians. But two 20th century presidents have moved quite a bit. Harry Truman and Dwight David Eisenhower. Since we're located right between Abilene and Independence, that makes a lot of us rightly proud. And I know that our current president is hoping against hope for the type of movement Truman had, who also, it is important to remember, left office during an unpopular war and with low public approval ratings. But let me talk about Eisenhower, because that's a different story. In the first survey commissioned by Professor Arthur Schlesinger Sr. in 1962, Ike was ranked 22nd out of 34 presidents to that date, as in very, very close to the bottom. If you recall, the conventional wisdom held Ike to be somewhat old and doddering. He liked his golf. He liked puttering around the White House lawn with his grandchildren. And compared to his successor, John F. Kennedy, he did appear older. He was also, of course, considered a benevolent and a little bit of a detached president. That was his reputation. Dwight Eisenhower routinely mangled English syntax in his press conferences, again, compared to JFK, who was witty and had that repartee thing going with the press corps. Eisenhower is seen as surrounded by powerful men who ran the government like a corporation. But historians and political scientists have, for the last 2 decades, consistently reevaluated President Eisenhower. One of the key reappraisals was by a former teacher of mine, Fred Greenstein at Princeton University. His Hidden Hand Presidency was a book where he held that Ike was a deft, behind-the-scenes mover and shaker who held all the reins of power in his own hands. He consistently dealt with political challenges with tact and persuasion, often hidden from the public light. 2 of these challenges, and I'm sure we'll hear about them tonight, were the red-baiting fear-mongering of Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin and a struggle to racially integrate the nation's schools after the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka decision in 1954. This last challenge, of course, culminated in the epic clash over integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and is one of the subjects of Kasey Pipe's recent remarkable bestseller, End of Our Lecture Tonight. In addition to his career as an author and biographer, Kasey Pipes is president of the Pipes Company, a corporate communications consulting firm, a commissioned officer in the United States Navy Reserve. Mr. Pipes served on Governor George W. Bush's campaign and later in the White House as a speechwriter, and was chief author of the 2004 National Republican Party platform. In 2006, he served as chief campaign speechwriter for California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He also has advised and crafted speeches for Rudy Giuliani, RNC Chairman Ken Mehlman, and Senator Bob Dole. His political writings have appeared in the influential Politico, RealClearPolitics.com, and World Magazine. He is now special contributor to the Dallas Morning News. Please welcome to the stage Kasey Pipes.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. And it is a pleasure to be here in Kansas and a privilege to be at the Dole Center. I should begin with a slight bit of humor from the man that I wrote a book about. Dwight Eisenhower would be quite amused, I think, that someone of my background would decide to research and write a book about him. He didn't think much of people like me. He didn't think much of speechwriters. He once said to one of his better speechwriters that if words and speeches were important to a president, then the American people ought to elect Hemingway. So I think he would be quite amused by my sort of going back and digging up his past and trying to relive some of it. I do want to thank the Dole Institute for making this event happen. I want to thank Jonathan, obviously, Jennifer Schmidt, Linda Kay, for all of their help in making these arrangements and bringing me here. When I first wrote the book, the very first person that I asked to comment and give a blurb for the back of it was Senator Bob Dole. And I did that on purpose because I knew of his affection for Eisenhower, and obviously being from Kansas and being alive during many of the years that I covered in the book, I thought it was a perfect fit. And I actually sent out several requests for blurbs for the back, and Bob Dole was the very first one that came in. And it now sits on the back cover at the top above George Willey. So I was very thrilled that Senator Dole did that for me. And of course, I can't be here and not mention my affiliation with the former director, Richard Norton Smith, who is a dear personal friend of mine. And I know that his work here in building this center was a labor of love. And it's wonderful to see this great institution, this great center, and all of the great work that's done here. Jonathan mentioned that I worked for Governor Schwarzenegger a couple of years ago. One night I was at dinner with his wife, Maria, and she said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "Why in the world are you writing a book about Eisenhower?" And I said to her, "Well, the fact that you had to ask that question is the reason that I'm writing the book, because Eisenhower deserves to be remembered." And I thought in particular this story was a piece of the Eisenhower story that had never been done right before. Before my book came out in February of 2007, it had been about 25 years since any book had been written about Eisenhower and civil rights, and no book had ever given him the credit that I think he deserves. He was a reluctant hero on the issue, but he was a hero nonetheless. And so the book broke a lot of new ground and still continues to make news. The Washington Post is doing a podcast on it this Friday. So a year into its life, the book continues to do well, and I attribute that to the man that I wrote about. Eisenhower is a fascinating president, and as I said, this is a fascinating part of his story. What began for me as a study of Little Rock, as a case study of Central High School, transformed during my research into a character study of Eisenhower. My project changed from when I first began it several years ago. I became less interested in the policy making than I became with the soul searching. What motivated Eisenhower? What was he trying to achieve? What shaped his views? What was he hoping to accomplish? What did he fear? In the book that I produced, Ike's Final Battle, The Road to Little Rock and the Challenge of Equality, is not a day-by-day, every single detail of his life biography. Rather, it is a portrait that picks stories from throughout his entire life, heavily focused on his Army career, because I think that's the key to understanding everything that he was as a professional, and trying to find out what all of those stories together tell us about how the man operated and what he thought about race relations and civil rights in America. This story is the story of how the greatest American hero of his time was forced to grapple with the greatest American dilemma of all time. This is the story of how Dwight Eisenhower came to terms with the civil rights revolution in America. And if you want to know how dramatic this story was in his own life, he later said that ordering troops into Little Rock Central High School was the hardest thing he'd ever had to do, harder than D-Day. This is a very dramatic, very important moment, not only in the life of this great American, but in the life of this great country. And so, what I ended up writing was a book that portrays his entire journey on the issue, primarily focused on his days in the Army, his days in the White House, and his days in Gettysburg as an elder statesman, when he continues to wrestle with the issue and continues to try to think of ways that the country can move forward. And so, what I want to do for a few moments tonight is, rather than read to you long sections of the book or recount every chapter of the book, I want to try to answer 3 questions about Eisenhower and civil rights. First, what did I believe on civil rights? Second, how did he approach the issue? And third, and maybe most interesting to me as a writer and historian, why has he never gotten any credit? And remember that much of what I drew on in this book was new material, but it was all new insight. This is all new territory in the sense that no one has ever thought of Eisenhower as a civil rights leader. And though I acknowledge it was a struggle for him personally, and he was a reluctant leader, there is much that we can learn about how he wrestled with the issue and how he managed change and produced positive results in the end. So let's take a look at each of these questions. First, what did Eisenhower believe about the nature of man and the equality of all Americans? As president, he was fond of saying that segregation was criminally stupid. It's a favorite saying of his. He said it over and over again. But he hadn't always felt that way. Again, particularly in his Army days, we see signs of very lazy assumptions that many white members of his generation and his class shared at that time. When he emerges from West Point in 1916, he's assigned to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, and one of his very first assignments is to train a group of Illinois National Guard troops, and they are African American, and Eisenhower is unimpressed. He's shocked at how poorly they shoot their guns, and he later says to an aide that he took it for granted, and these are his words, that black people were stupid. 2 decades later, as a major, he finds himself with the Philippines serving under General McCarthy. He is again tasked to train troops of color. He is again unimpressed. He writes in his diary that he has learned to expect from the Filipino troops, quote, a minimum of performance from a maximum of promise. So as World War II begins in 1941, Eisenhower holds very conventional views for an Army officer, very lazy assumptions that he really hadn't been forced to think through. World War II changes that. First, Eisenhower notices the courage of the Tuskegee Airmen. He even goes and personally congratulates them after a big dogfight over the Mediterranean. He later hears about a black soldier condemned to death for sleeping with a white civilian in London. He thinks it's ridiculous. He lifts the sentence. And he finds out about press prohibitions on covering African American troops, and he thinks that's bad for morale back home. If black families can't learn about their troops, he lifts the prohibition. They're minor steps, but they show him moving in the right direction. But the greatest change of all comes from the greatest battle of all, and that's the Battle of the Bulge. Here, when the Nazis successfully pushed back his line, Eisenhower was desperate for troops. And so he issued an order allowing the troops, without regard to color or race, those were his words, could serve at the front. Now, he hedged a bit later and sent out a separate instruction after many of his officers complained. And he ended up offering them the chance to go to the front in their own units rather than be shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers. Nevertheless, the African American soldiers were thrilled with this new policy. Thousands came forward. By the time their training was over, the Battle of the Bulge had ended, but they did serve in subsequent battles at the end of the war, and they served very well, and the general noticed. And Eisenhower was impressed. And he later said to an aide that that was the defining moment for him, that seeing those troops come forward made a difference. He said, and these are his words, the thing I will never forget is the sacrifice that those black soldiers made after the Bulge. So World War II changes Eisenhower on race. It also changes the civil rights movement. Soldiers who went to the front of the line in battle weren't eager to go to the back of the bus in Birmingham upon their return. And so you see at the end of World War II, the NAACP growing greatly in membership. You see new leadership coming along like Thurgood Marshall, who want to take the civil rights movement in new directions. And a lot of it is based on the success of African Americans in the war. They fought the greatest military ever put together, supposedly, in the Nazis. They've helped destroy them. Surely they can come back to America and expect better than Jim Crow. And so there's a tremendous amount of momentum. In fact, many of Eisenhower's actions in the war helped create change even in the military. For example, Truman K. Gibson, who was an assistant in the Truman administration at the War Department, went in and studied Ike's experiment with African American troops after the bulge. He declared the experiment a success, which then led to the famous Gillum report, which questioned the use of segregated units in the first place, which then later led to the Charles Wilson Commission, which famously issued the Secure These Rights Commission in 1948, which then led to President Truman's Executive Order 9981. I bet not very many people in this room tonight realize that Harry Truman's executive order desegregating the military has its origins in Eisenhower's order at the Battle of the Bulge. That's literally where it began, and you can trace it through the paperwork for about 5 years after that. So World War II begins to change not only the military but the country. And as World War II ends, the civil rights movement is moving on to new battles and new vistas, and Eisenhower's career is just getting started. The man who saved the world from Hitler is going to be heard from again. The American people are going to turn to him again, and they do in the 1950s when he's elected president. So that leads to our second question tonight, which is, as president, how did he approach this very difficult domestic issue of civil rights? I think there are 4 pieces of the Eisenhower strategy on civil rights that are all really fascinating, and we should spend just a 30 seconds or a minute on each one of these because they explain much of what he was trying to do and what he hoped to accomplish. First, Eisenhower believes there are limits to federal power. And here is the dilemma he faces. How do you promote minority rights in a country governed by majority rule? And how do you do it when it's not at all clear that a majority wants change on civil rights? And indeed, I document in the book many of the polls that were out at the time showed great ambivalence among the country about moving too far or too fast on civil rights. That's a profound political challenge that Eisenhower faced. Second, Eisenhower believes there are limits to the rhetorical presidency. He is seeking in his words and his speeches to turn the volume down, not turn it up. And so when Dr. Martin Luther King asked him publicly to come south, convene a summit, and deliver a speech on civil rights, Eisenhower declines. This is precisely what he doesn't want to do. As he often says to his staff, another phrase that he uses over and over again in meetings, he doesn't want to inflame passions. He actually thinks that speeches might make things worse because they would get people in the South on both sides very, very agitated, and he wants to try to work behind the scenes. Third, Eisenhower believes in a conservative approach. Eisenhower doesn't believe that you can perfect the world. He doesn't believe that you can have drastic change overnight. He later complains in the 1960s that part of the problem with the Great Society and President Johnson was that its, quote, glib assurances, that's how he characterized it, had raised expectation levels to an unsustainable level. So in other words, when you tell people that racism is going to disappear, when you tell people that we're going to have a war on poverty and get rid of poverty in short order, and then when those things don't happen, you create civil unrest. And Eisenhower believed some of the riots that we saw in Watts and Detroit and other places in the 60s were in many cases results of overblown promises that the government couldn't keep. Eisenhower, as a conservative, favors evolution over revolution, incremental reform to a drastic restructuring of society. And he believes, as part of his approach, that you have to do much more than change laws. You have to do something more profound. You have to change hearts and minds in the South. And no less a source than Dr. King recognized this. When Martin Luther King met with Eisenhower in the Oval Office in 1958, he pronounced him sincere on the civil rights issue, but he felt that, quote, Eisenhower believed the surgeon's knife was an instrument too radical to touch this best of all societies. It's a marvelous metaphor, and it perfectly captures Eisenhower's approach, that he was a conservative who wanted step-by-step change rather than try to get everything at once when he didn't think he could and when he thought expectation levels might actually create unintended consequences. Fourth, and I think this is the most fascinating part of Eisenhower's leadership, as all great leaders, Eisenhower, on this issue and on other issues as president, sees not just where things are today, but where things are headed tomorrow. Almost from the beginning and almost alone among observers, Ike senses that a Little Rock-style crisis just might erupt somewhere, someday, if he doesn't very carefully handle this issue. Listen to what he wrote in his diary on July 24th, 1953, 4 years before Central High School in Little Rock erupts. I believe that federal law imposed upon our states in such a way as to bring about a conflict of the police powers of the states and of the nation would set back the cause of progress in race relations for a long, long time. So Eisenhower, to his credit, sees that this is a very difficult issue and that if he doesn't move very carefully and very cautiously, he might end up with a violent situation somewhere in America, which, of course, as we all know, he ends up getting in the end. But it's to his credit that he saw it, he anticipated it, and he tried at all costs to avoid it. So what were some of the things consistent with these 4 pieces of his philosophy that Eisenhower tried to do to create progress? Well, first of all, he starts where he has authority. He has authority over the military, and he finishes the job that Harry Truman had begun of desegregating the military. Most people don't realize that the military had largely dragged its heels following Executive Order 9981, and the military was still largely segregated in 1953. By the end of 1953, it is largely desegregated because Eisenhower sent word to make it happen, including his Navy Secretary Robert Anderson, who desegregated some of the most segregated posts in the military, which were the Navy bases in the South, particularly Charleston. Those are desegregated by the end of the year. He desegregates the District of Columbia, which in 1953 is a preserved federal government. They have auspices and government over it. And he even, in areas where he doesn't have power, such as private facilities in the district, uses peer pressure. He calls in Hollywood executives like Spiro Skouras of 20th Century Fox and Barney Balaban of Paramount, and he peer pressures them in the Oval Office to do the right thing and lead by example and desegregate your movie theaters. And guess what? They did. He also, under the advice and counsel of his Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, began appointing fair-minded Republican judges all throughout the South, who in later years will render the most important court victories for the civil rights movement. Andrew Young said that when he and Dr. King in the 1960s were court shopping in the South, they had a very simple criteria. They wanted to avoid a court where there was a Kennedy judge, and they wanted to find a court where there was an Eisenhower judge, because those were the judges that were giving them the rulings that they needed. The Kennedy judges were Dixiecrats. And fourth, and largely forgotten in history, Eisenhower appoints the first African American to a president's senior staff, Fred Morrow. And Fred Morrow becomes very important in the book. I follow him throughout because he becomes almost a character witness to Eisenhower. He has many soul-searching conversations with Eisenhower about his approach, his very conservative approach, which Morrow in many ways thinks is a little too little and a little too slow. But something happens in 1954 that changes all of this, and that's the Brown ruling. The Brown ruling on school segregation in the South is nothing if not a revolution. And so Eisenhower and the country have to pick up the pace. And both do. Eisenhower begins to push for the first major civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It's later signed in 1957, just before Little Rock erupts. And of course, most dramatically, he enforces the Brown decision in the first major test of Brown, which is at Little Rock. Very hard to imagine how the Brown ruling would have succeeded, how segregation could have been defeated if Eisenhower had not intervened at Little Rock. Little Rock becomes, in many ways, one of the most, if not the most important civil rights battles of all time. And it certainly was the gravest constitutional crisis since the Civil War. And just to briefly recount the scene, you had Governor Orville Fowles of Arkansas calling out Arkansas National Guard troops to block the entry of the 9 African-American students who had been selected to integrate Central High, the crown jewel of the Little Rock school system. And it literally falls to the president to decide how this issue is going to be resolved. And I think throughout his handling of Little Rock, Eisenhower shows a lot of leadership skills that are familiar to fans of Eisenhower. He first of all tries to let the crisis play out. He tries to give space to local leaders to let them find a local solution. He works through an intermediary, in this case Congressman Brooks Hayes of Little Rock, who goes back and forth with messages to the governor and then to the White House. When that doesn't work, he responds to the governor's request for a meeting. They meet in September at the naval base in Rhode Island, where Eisenhower was staying. They have a private meeting for 20 minutes, the highlight of which was Faubus telling him, "There's nothing I can do. The troops are there to prevent a mob rule," which, by the way, I show in the book, There's evidence to suggest that Faubus had orchestrated the mob to give him a reason to send out the troops. And he says to Eisenhower, I can't do anything. I have to have these troops there. They have orders. And Eisenhower, one of the greatest military figures in our history, says that's a pretty easy problem to solve. You change their orders. And what you do is you put in their orders that they're there to stop the mob, but they're also there to protect the kids. And Eisenhower, to the day he died, believed that he in fact had that deal from Faubus, that Faubus would do exactly that. Of course, Faubus didn't do exactly that. He returned home. He continued to be in defiance. And finally, on September 24th, Eisenhower of 1957, Eisenhower responds by not only federalizing the Arkansas National Guard, but sending in the 101st Airborne, one of the most prestigious units in the United States military, and a unit that had explicit authority from him and exact abilities to control the crowd and protect the kids, as Eisenhower had wanted Faubus to do in the first place. Listen to what Eisenhower said in a letter that he wrote the day he was signing the orders to send in the 101st Airborne. He said, the federal government has ample resources with which to deal with this sort of thing. The great need is to act calmly and deliberately so as to give everyone space to do the right thing. Eisenhower was the calmest person in the middle of this crisis. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't upset. He wasn't railing against Faubus. He wasn't railing to his staff. He was very calm. He wanted to try to let it play out. When all else failed, when all diplomacy failed, when all of his emissaries failed, when his meeting with Faubus failed, then he went to his last resort. And his last resort was federal troops. No president wants to send federal troops into an American city. It's a horrible option. It's a last option, and it was for Eisenhower. But he didn't hesitate to do it when he saw it was the only way to resolve the crisis and uphold federal law at Little Rock, which is what he did. And I think in many ways, this is part of why, and I'll touch on this in just a minute, Eisenhower hasn't gotten credit. If we look back in history and say that he should have acted sooner, that he should have sent troops in sooner, I actually think it is to his credit that he acted cautiously and carefully and deliberately because so much was at stake and because sending troops into an American city is a last option for anybody. And that's the way it should be. So that brings us to, very briefly, his post-presidency, when, as I say, he's even more progressive on the issue. I mean, he really, by the time the 1960s comes around, believes that this is part of his legacy, that he did a lot of important things on the issue, and even though he may have struggled with it earlier in his life, it's important for the country to get moving and to do even more. He works behind the scenes with John Kennedy in 1963 after Birmingham to get Republican support for his legislation that had never been reported before I found the documents in my book. He meets with Barry Goldwater in 1964 and has a very abrasive meeting with him in which he makes a series of demands to him, including that he publicly denounced the Ku Klux Klan, which shows how little he thought of Goldwater, and chastises him for opposing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He mourns the loss of Dr. King, and he urges Richard Nixon to consider Herbert Brownell for the Supreme Court. Herbert Brownell, as his Attorney General, had been the most progressive member of his administration on the issue, which shows you that Eisenhower's thinking continued to move in that direction in the 1960s. This leads to our final question. Why hasn't he gotten any credit on this? This is a pretty good record. It's an honorable record. He was reluctant at times, and he had some problems, as I mentioned earlier, in implementing change. But why hasn't he gotten much credit? I think there's a couple of reasons. One is Eisenhower himself didn't seek credit. He was an inherently modest man. He was not one to send out a press release or pat himself on the back. And in particular, the scene at Little Rock, which we now think of as a great success and a great moment in his administration. Eisenhower didn't see it that way. Eisenhower viewed Little Rock as a failure, not a success. Anytime a president has to send troops into a city to make people behave, it's not something that he's particularly proud of. Eisenhower viewed Little Rock as a very embarrassing chapter. He spoke in his speech to the nation on September 24th, 1957, when he announced the troops were going in. He talked about the world looking at America and looking at Little Rock and seeing that we don't always live out our democratic ideals. And Eisenhower very much wanted to do that. And so he didn't see Little Rock as something to brag about in his memoirs. In fact, I found a fascinating letter from his editor at Doubleday when he's writing his memoirs in the 60s, reminding him, be sure and talk about Little Rock. Be sure and talk about civil rights. Because it was such a painful topic that Eisenhower didn't really want to spend a lot of time on Little Rock. And because he didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, historians haven't either. He hasn't gotten the credit that he deserves. Another reason is that Eisenhower's friends have given him very little credit. And to me, this is one of the most fascinating parts of the book. It's very easy, I think, to construct a case that says Eisenhower was a civil rights president. He had a plan from the very beginning. He wanted to sign civil rights legislation. He wanted to act decisively in Little Rock. He cared passionately about the issue. This is something he really wanted to be a part of his legacy. You can construct that case. The problem is it ignores all of the evidence from people that knew him. It ignores the oral histories and the memoirs of people like Ann Whitman, his secretary, Stephen Benedict, Art Larson, a great speechwriter, Jim Haggerty, his press secretary, who was with him every day, Swede Hazlitt, one of his very best friends in the world from Abilene, C.D. Jackson, Fred Morrow, his African-American aide, who had many, as I mentioned, very challenging conversations with Eisenhower about the race, Max Rabb, who dealt with the civil rights profile as secretary to the cabinet, Governor Scranton in Pennsylvania, who's still alive and I interviewed, and Herbert Brownell. All of these people who all loved Eisenhower and revered him, they all basically say the same thing, which has become the conventional wisdom, at least I hope until my book came out, which is that Eisenhower did what he had to do, but it wasn't something that he really wanted to deal with and really enjoyed dealing with. So what I did in my approach was, rather than ignore all of that scholarship, all of Stephen Ambrose's work, all of these oral histories from people who were eyewitnesses, I don't argue that those accounts are inaccurate. I just argue that they're incomplete. And I think if you look back, particularly at the oral histories of his staff members, they were each with him during a piece of time. They were each with him for a couple of years. And what I try to do is show the entire journey from start to finish. Almost none of the people that we have oral histories from were with him and talked to him at Gettysburg in the 60s, when he's confronting Goldwater, when he's working with Kennedy behind the scenes, when he's talking to Richard Nixon about what a great Supreme Court Justice Herbert Brownell will be, when he's mourning the loss of Dr. King. These folks weren't here when he was doing that. And so rather than discount all of them, I factor them into my account, I use them as character witnesses, and I show that it was a struggle for him. He was a reluctant warrior on this issue, but he was a warrior nonetheless. He saw his duty, he wrestled with the issue, just as the country wrestled with the issue, and in the end, he made a huge and profound difference on civil rights that in many ways, if you look at the 1950s accomplishments, that becomes the bedrock, that becomes the foundation for the successes of the civil rights movement going into the 1960s and beyond. So far from giving you a Valentine, I give you the whole Eisenhower, the good, bad, and the ugly. And I give you a direction, that Eisenhower was always moving in the right direction, working his way through the issue, and finding his way home. And in that sense, there's a real universal application, I think, to the story, because all of us struggle, and all of us change, and all of us wrestle with life. And Eisenhower shows that you can take a very difficult issue, a profound issue that had confounded the founding fathers and every president since the founding, and you can wrestle with it, and you can make your way, and you can make a difference. And that's what Eisenhower did. My favorite story in the whole book comes from Fred Morrow, his African-American aide, who challenged him one time about some of his racist comments in the past when he was in the Army. And Eisenhower looked at him for a long time, and then he said, "Son, isn't your father a minister?" And Fred Morrow said, "Well, yes, he is." And he says, "Well, then you know about forgiveness." And I think in many ways there's a real redemptive quality to this story. That Eisenhower, who began his career in the Army having very conventional views on race, becomes a man who not only signs the first civil rights legislation from Reconstruction, not only sends in the troops to Little Rock and wins arguably the most important integration battle of all time, but even in his post-presidency years as an elder statesman, is continuing to move forward and urge the country to do even more and to do it faster. So this is a story of change, of a great leader dealing with a difficult issue and finding his way home. And let me conclude with a couple of thoughts on leadership, because Eisenhower is nothing if not a great leader and someone that we can all study from and learn how to wrestle with life and how to manage and how to lead. I think we learn a number of things from Eisenhower's leader. We learn that leaders don't just do things right, they do the right thing. And the right thing, though often simple, is almost never easy. We learn that any politician can make a statement, but only a leader can make a difference. And a real difference often comes through action more than words, over time, not overnight. And we learn that in the stormy seas of life, steady must be the hand at the helm, calm must be the mind, and confident must be the demeanor. For the crew, and sometimes even nature itself, will respond to the captain. And we learn that the powerful chemistry of leadership is composed of two elements, courage and conviction. Courage makes conviction possible, and conviction gives courage its meaning. So, to answer Maria Shriver's question, why did I do Eisenhower? Because Eisenhower deserves to be written about. He deserves to be read about. He deserves to be remembered. And he still speaks to us even today. Here is a great man wrestling with a difficult issue, and in the end, making a real difference. That's a great story. I'm honored to be able to tell it. I hope I did it justice, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thanks for having me. You start over here? Oh, right here.
Yes. I understand that the culture of the regular army at the time that President Eisenhower was graduated by the U.S. Military Academy at West Point was conventional on race, but I'm surprised that West Point itself may not have in its teaching of cadets to inculcate honor and trust and fellowship and camaraderie. Didn't include the races of the day. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, it's even more profound than that. I mean, you raise a great point. I mean, think about the Declaration. I mean, the country as a whole has a pretty high standard that it set out for itself at the very beginning that for an entire race of people need not apply. And it's just sort of amazing that the words didn't match the policies. I'm a Navy guy myself. I mean, our motto is honor, courage, commitment. And you could say the same thing there. I mean, the Navy in many ways was even more racist and even more segregated. And I talk about that some in the book, how Eisenhower spent a lot of time with Robert Anderson, as Secretary of the Navy, desegregating the Navy. I just think it's reflective and it's revealing of so much of the American character for 150 years that there was this birth defect in our Constitution that we just sort of pretended was okay. And as I say, I mean that's why this issue is so interesting to me as a historian and as a writer, because no one had figured it out. No one had figured out as a leader, certainly not as a president, how do you actually go about changing people's minds? How do you actually go about implementing change? And I think in many ways, we tend to look back and say, well, Eisenhower, he did a little bit, but he could have done more. Well, in many ways, he was ahead of his time. And I talk about some of his contemporaries in the book. Adlai Stevenson being one, who when Eisenhower asked him to serve on the Civil Rights Commission, which Eisenhower was very proud of, he thought that was a very important way to sort of bring people together and talk through these issues, Stevenson refused. Lyndon Johnson was very critical of his actions at Little Rock, said that we should have no troops on either side, as if keeping the 9 kids out was the same as letting them in. I mean, the moral equivalence there is pretty appalling. John Kennedy was critical of it. But again, at least in those 2 cases, Johnson and Kennedy, those men changed. And we give them credit for that in history, that they changed, and as presidents, they became leaders on the issue. Well, guess what? Eisenhower changed too. And so I just think the same standard should be applied to him as applied to others. But you raise a great point. It is remarkable that the military of all places was in many ways one of the most segregated parts of society. And that's what produced Eisenhower, and yet Eisenhower helps sort of turn that around in the end.
We hold up the United States Military Academy and the United States Naval Academy and the United States Air Force Academy and the Coast Guard Academy and the Marine Academy as the epitome of honor, duty, country. And you would think that the teaching there would, at that time, should have included some aspect on human rights.
Right.
But it obviously didn't.
No, and in fact, I talk in the book about the War Department during World War II. George Marshall was in charge of the War Department. George Marshall was a great man, a great figure in history. He was a very racist guy. And much of the War Department policy segregating troops came directly from the pen of Marshall. And in fact, part of Eisenhower's challenge when at the Battle of the Bulge he decides, hey, this is not working, I need to use all my troops at the front, even the guys in the Supply Corps, which are the African Americans who are they have to be there by law, by War Department policy. I got to change that. Part of Eisenhower sort of hedging a bit on the orders that he issued was to sort of find a way through the War Department objections and the objections of his own staff, Beadle Smith included. So it's a sad chapter for the military that they didn't sort of see the hypocrisy in their own principles and yet their own policies. But on the other hand, I mean, Eisenhower's nothing if not a military man, and so it's a little bit happier chapter that Eisenhower helps become part of the solution. Yes, sir.
Greatly admire the way you have delved into the whole problem and researched it well. And so I have a kind of a burning question that I wouldn't have had even, I'd say about 3 months ago is when I learned this fact. On a PBS television program, I heard a comment about Eisenhower. The whole program wasn't about him, but when they got to him, it had to do
with the war, wasn't it?
And all, yeah.
Yeah.
This was the comment that Eisenhower had admitted to someone in confidence. It wasn't something to be published greatly. Had admitted that he deliberately, as a lifestyle and as a leadership style, tried to hide his talents and actually act a little clumsy and dumb because he could get more done that way. And I wonder if you could support that in any way from your researches. I'd like to hear more about that, and I think the audience would too.
No, it's a great question. Thank you, sir. It's a great question, and it's one I get asked a lot, and it's true. Eisenhower, behind the scenes, was very different than Eisenhower the image, and that was by design. Eisenhower felt, for a number of reasons, that it was very important to have sort of an amiable presence, for people to think of him as sort of a doting grandfather, a kindly, elderly man. Even the golf was a part of this, that, this is a guy that took time for recreation and loved cookouts with family, all of which is true. I mean, he did all of those things, but it was all very carefully choreographed to disguise the fact that behind the scenes, this is a tremendously efficient, effective, meticulous planner and manager. In fact, Richard Nixon said that Eisenhower was the most ruthless man I ever knew. And then he added, as only Nixon could, ruthless in the best sense of the word. But what he meant by that is, this is a guy that did tough things. This was a hard man, which doesn't fit with the image of the grandfather playing golf. And so, absolutely, it was a very deliberate design. And Jonathan mentioned earlier in his introduction, there's a whole book that was written about 25 years ago called The Hidden Hand. And this is essentially the thesis of The Hidden Hand, that if you go back and you look at the archives, as I have, and as Fred Greenstein did when he wrote his book, that Eisenhower looks very different when you study him in cabinet meetings than he does when he's, cutting a ribbon at a school opening somewhere. He's a very tough man, very abrasive and to the point and hard on his staff and asking all the tough questions and yet he wanted to sort of find a way to kind of disguise that from the general public who revered him as this grandfather figure. So I actually think it was a brilliant strategy. And think about, for example, one of his contemporaries, McCarthy. I mean, MacArthur wore everything on his sleeve. I mean, he, ran around, talking about his decision-making process and talking in the third person about MacArthur's going to, take back the Philippines. And remember, Eisenhower spent several years with MacArthur, and so I think a lot of his leadership style was a reaction against that. To be sort of the behind-the-scenes guy, not the guy out doing press conferences all the time. So But your point is well taken, because that's part of why historians have taken so long to come around to Eisenhower. They bought into the image, and they haven't really looked at the documents as well as they should.
Thank you. Kasey, a couple of quick comments and then the question.
Sure.
First is, he might not have been wild about a speechwriter, but he would have liked your Navy officership.
Thanks.
Second, while the military was probably reflective of the country in the academies, when he was talking about it earlier, it was also, and you can comment on this, agree or disagree, it was also leading in desegregation because of part of what Eisenhower was doing and others.
Right.
And then last, in Little Rock, how much, and I don't know whether you researched it in your book, how much did Eisenhower struggle over federal versus states' rights in federalizing the National Guard? And then how does that connect to as recent as Katrina, where President Bush did not do a similar thing? Congress went back, changed the laws, said you should do it, and now they've changed it back to states' rights again.
Another great question. Eisenhower, and again, this is a part of the misconception about Eisenhower and Little Rock. The conventional wisdom has always been he only viewed this as a law and order issue, and that once he saw the mobs in Little Rock that he decided to send in the troops. That's actually not true. In fact, he, from the very beginning, said that he viewed it as a matter of the supremacy of federal law, that this was a federal court order. It didn't matter if the state governor didn't like it. It was the law, and in fact, I mean, there's a fascinating exchange of telegrams right at the beginning of Little Rock, where Faubus sends Eisenhower this letter, sort of looking for a way out, kind of. I think probably surprised by the media coverage. It's a huge media event. TV cameras show it all over the world. It's on the top of the headlines every day in the papers. He sends Eisenhower this telegram and says, I'm sort of besieged, and the FBI's wiretapping me. It's just crazy, and I'd like to have a meeting with you. And Eisenhower writes him back. Again, this is pretty. At least my take on it is very new and runs counter to conventional wisdom. Eisenhower writes him back in his very first response, first week of September 1957, and says, "That's fine. You can come up here. You can have a meeting with me, but please understand two things. Number one, the only purpose of the meeting is going to be to decide how we go about upholding federal law and getting the kids into school." So Eisenhower was perfectly clear with him what his intentions were. And second, Eisenhower makes a none too thinly veiled reference to the National Guard troops and says, oh, by the way, those troops you're using, those Arkansas National Guard troops you're using to block the orders of the federal court, those actually belong to the federal government and can be taken away from you, which of course they were. So I think Eisenhower viewed it correctly from the beginning as an issue of the supremacy of federal law. And historians, for some reason, have and Ambrose does this as well. I mean, they tend to think that he viewed it as a law and order issue. I never found anywhere where he said that. He was always upholding the orders of the court. About Katrina, which is a great point, and I get asked that question a lot. I remember I was in Kansas, I was in Abilene, finishing up the research on the book, and I remember reading in the New York Times, this was when Katrina was going on, and there was a story about why the president didn't send troops in. And I remember reading an off-the-record, non-attributed aide said, well, can you imagine what would happen if a president sent in troops to a city? And I remember reading it and thinking out loud, yeah, I'm writing a book about a guy who did it. But I think that shows that it is a very difficult decision. No president wants to do it. It's a bad last option because someone's going to get hurt. And in fact, people got hurt in Little Rock. There was at least one gentleman I found who, essentially, when the 101st set up their perimeter and then they began patrolling out to disperse the mob. I mean, there was a guy who took a bayonet. I mean, he lived, but still, as a president, you don't want your troops bayoneting people in your cities. They're citizens too. So it's a last resort for any president. But I think, as I show in the book, Eisenhower exhausted every other option short of that. And rather than criticize him for that, which most historians have done, I give him credit for that. I think he should have tried everything short of using military force. But then when that failed, he didn't hesitate to use it and use it overwhelmingly, and he did. And within a couple of weeks, by the way, the crisis was over. I mean, the troops had dispersed the mob, the kids were in the school, and it was handled very effectively.
I've always heard that. Oh,
Where are
over
we?
here.
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
I've always heard that President Eisenhower always regretted appointing Justice Brennan to the court, and I wonder in his later years how he viewed the revolution that was worked by the Warren Court with regard to civil rights and other issues.
I deal with that a little bit in the book, particularly with Warren. I get asked a lot about did he say that that was the biggest mistake he ever made. I never found any evidence that he said that. In fact, Herbert Brownell actually researched this as well when he was doing his memoirs, Eisenhower's Attorney General. He couldn't find it either. What he found was there was a Republican state committee man, I think in Oregon, who claimed that he had lunch with Eisenhower at Gettysburg one day and Eisenhower said it to him. There's no contemporaneous witnesses. No one else backs it up. It was just this one guy saying that. What we do know he said, because he said it to a pretty good source, he said it to Stephen Ambrose, was that he thought Warren was a dumb son of a bitch. Now, I document in the book the deterioration of the relationship, and it was a brutal deterioration. There's no denying that. But interestingly, it had almost nothing to do, as far as I can tell, with civil rights. It had to do with law and order cases. And in fact, if you look in Warren's memoir, Warren essentially wages a campaign against Eisenhower in his retirement. And his memoir is a big part of that. I mean, Warren was just livid that Eisenhower didn't come out and support the Brown decision publicly, which Eisenhower had a policy of not publicly commenting on cases other than to say, which he did after the Brown ruling, this is the law and I'm going to enforce it, and he said that repeatedly. But Warren was really bitter about that, and so in his memoirs he really takes the bark off and really goes after Eisenhower. And he even tells a story, which I think is revealing in itself, that Eisenhower and Warren went to Churchill's funeral together in January of '65, and as they're flying over on the plane, Warren confronts Eisenhower and says, why are you so unhappy with me? And revealingly, and this is Warren's account, Eisenhower says the communist cases. So even by Warren's own account, it had nothing to do with civil rights. I actually document in the book the deterioration of the relationship. It actually goes back to the 52 convention. It was the only promise the Eisenhower campaign made, which is that Warren would get the next Supreme Court spot. Eisenhower interpreted that to mean the next justice spot. And so what happened when Chief Justice Vinson died, the first opening was the Chief Justice spot. Eisenhower did not think the deal covered that. Warren thought it did. And Warren began playing hardball with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower really resented it. I mean, really thought that this was way out of line for this guy to be, making these demands. We'll put him on the court eventually, but, stop trying to push us around. And as just really a matter of honor, Eisenhower ended up doing it anyway, but that was the beginning. And Eisenhower really, really resented how Warren handled that he played hardball on that. And he absolutely played hardball on that. So it's a fascinating story, the deterioration of the relationship, but it really, in my opinion, and I searched it quite a lot, was largely unrelated to Brown. And in fact, remember, let's not forget, the Brown ruling, Herbert Brownell talks to Eisenhower and convinces him to submit a brief on behalf of the NAACP. So the official Eisenhower position was in favor of the Brown ruling. Now, Eisenhower did express to some aides some concern over the logistics of it, in the sense of, how do you go into every school district in America and create equal schools? I mean, what's the ratio? How do you do that? And indeed, that was a problem that was perplexing for years, and it took a fleet of yellow school buses to fix that in the 70s. So he was not far off in asking some of these questions, but he certainly was not on the wrong side of the issue, even if he wondered about the implementation of it. Yes, sir.
If you can identify any other problems that President Eisenhower dealt with the same kind of style. McCarthy, for example.
Well, there's a whole chapter in my book. I mean, McCarthy, in many ways, is sort of a pre-season version of the hidden hand. It happens in 53 and 54, so it's early on in the administration. But it's an early taste of how Eisenhower will deal with very difficult issues. And part of it was a reaction to Harry Truman. Truman, as you recall, had publicly denounced McCarthy. I think he even did it from the Oval Office. Eisenhower had an instinct and an insight, which I think was correct, which was that was exactly what McCarthy wanted. McCarthy wanted a fight with the president. He wanted the guy in the Oval Office to be saying the name Joe McCarthy. There's no bad press for Joe McCarthy. And so Eisenhower's strategy was the opposite of Truman, which is don't talk about him in the Oval Office, don't talk about him anywhere. But in the meantime, while you're not talking about him, actively work behind the scenes to discredit him. And you know, with my apologies to Hollywood and you know their recent movie about the Morrow and his role in destroying McCarthy, Eisenhower destroyed McCarthy, and it was a very deliberate plan, which is not to minimize the media's role, but it would not have happened without the Eisenhower plan. And the Eisenhower plan essentially was give the guy enough rope, let him get out there on a ledge, which he eventually did in taking on the Army. And then remember, Welch, the lawyer, the famous lawyer who confronts McCarthy, guess where he came from? He came from Sherman Adams. Eisenhower administration sent him over there. They recommended him. And then, of course, the real masterstroke in Eisenhower's handling that was claiming executive order and essentially cutting McCarthy off from information. And it was a brilliant and brutal strategy for just breaking the guy's back, and it worked very effectively. And in many ways, as I say, I mean, that was really the first major domestic policy crisis, but it showed some of the same traits and some of the same skills that he would use later. Oh, sure. And historians still say, that he should have denounced McCarthy, should have come out publicly. And again, it was exactly what he was trying to not do. He was trying to avoid that and work behind the scenes, which he did very effectively. Right here? Okay.
I've always been a little fascinated with how people go about writing president's speeches. Do you meet one-on-one with the president, and then he tells you the points he feels strongly about? Then how do you go about making it sound like him?
Your question, in many ways, answers itself. You do often meet with the person you're writing for. That's my preferable method. You get their take on it at the beginning. You hear the things I want to say. And then you go and you try to find a way to write it that matches their rhythm and matches their cadence and what I like to say matches their brand, matches their narrative. I mean, you can have the best speech in the world, but if it doesn't match that guy's story, there's a disconnect with the audience. And you see this all the time in politics, of politicians who get up and they have wonderful lyrical passages about topics that don't fit with who they are. I mean, they're on the National Security Committee and they're giving this speech about the environment. I mean, there's a disconnect. And so I always try to make sure that whoever I'm writing for, I figure out first what his or her narrative is. What's the story? What's the brand? What is it this person is known for and that people like about this person? What's different? And then make sure that all of the words and speeches flow from that and are consistent with that. Because again, there's a disconnect if you don't do it. And Eisenhower, by the way, he had a number of very fine speechwriters. He also was a fine speechwriter himself. He had written for Pershing as a young officer. He also wrote for McCarthy. And in fact, the speech he gave to the nation on September 24th, 1957, announcing his actions at Little Rock, I actually found the documents in the archives. He was flying back from Newport, Rhode Island, where he was staying. And on the plane, he got out these little cards with DDE at the top. Dwight David Eisenhower initials. And they still have these cards. This is handwritten notes about what he wants to say to the country. He got back that afternoon. His speechwriters cleaned it up a little bit. But it was largely based on the draft, or at least the outline that he had written. And I think it was a really fine speech as far as striking just the right tone. I mean, remember, again, going back to what I said earlier, the political challenge he faced in a divided country. What was it he could say that would sort of, calm both sides down? People in the North that wanted him to do more, and white people in the South who were furious. And, there's a great line at the very beginning of the speech where he talks about how he had been staying in Rhode Island, but he wanted to come to the Oval Office. He wanted to come to the House of Jackson and Lincoln to convey both the sadness with which he had taken this action and the firmness with which he intended to carry it out. And I think as a speechwriter, I don't know that I've ever seen a better framing of a speech than that. To be able to say right at the very beginning to friend and foe alike, I am sad I had to do this, but it is going to happen. And then everything from the speech sort of flowed from that. It was a very nice speech. Speech writing is sort of an interesting art. I mean, there are some tricks to the trade, but it's kind of an area where he doesn't get a lot of credit. And frankly, this is one of the areas I criticize him on because while I do agree that it made sense to turn down the volume a little bit on the issue, I think when Eisenhower spoke, it carried so much weight that it really might have been helpful if he had occasionally spoken out like he did at Little Rock. When he had to at Little Rock, he did it very well, and the country responded pretty favorably. I think he could have done that maybe before Little Rock. And so I think in some ways, in the book, you'll see I criticize him for not using his rhetorical powers as much as he probably could have. I did not. I majored in speech and political science, but I'm a big literature fan, and we were talking about Hemingway earlier, and Capote, and all those guys are big influences on me. And indeed, in writing this book, Capote is a huge influence to me because he literally invents the concept that you can take a non-fiction story and make it read like fiction. And that's kind of what I tried to do with this book. Obviously not as well, but hopefully if you read it, it'll entertain you and you won't fall asleep reading it. Oh, sorry. Sure.
Have you given any thought as to Eisenhower's, when he was a junior officer in the 20s and the 30s, his involvement in the efforts of Army officers to modernize and improve the Army?
Absolutely, and there's quite a bit in the book covering. He was a major for 16 years, so I spend quite a bit of time covering his sort of staff officer days, and really one of the most pivotal moments in that time period is the time that he spent with Fox Connor, and Fox Connor in many ways encourages Eisenhower. It's like a graduate school. When he's in Panama with Fox Connor, he's giving him Clausewitz and giving him all these books to read and then quizzing him on them later. And I think Eisenhower begins to believe, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but my sense is that he began to see the importance of professional officers thinking more broadly about things, reading widely, becoming more educated on a whole host of issues. And of course, when he's at Fort Meade with Patton, they literally revolutionized the whole concept of how you use tanks. So he's always looking at new angles and new ideas and new thoughts. And he says later in a book that he wrote right before he died that his advice to young people, and I've always thought this comes from his experience with Fox Connor, that his advice to young people is always surround yourself with people who are smarter than you and who see more clearly than you and who are more experienced than you because they can fill in the gaps. And so I think he began to see, and again, the book I wrote is the story of his growth and his evolution. He began to see that it's important to always be learning, to always be changing, to always find new things, whether it's with weapons, the tanks I mentioned earlier, or with personnel issues like integration. I think that he began to see that learning never ends, and that's the military hasn't always understood that. I think it's better today than it's ever been. But yeah, I think he was very much a part of that.
Given Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex, how would he view the United States in the 21st century?
This is another question I get asked a lot. It's very hard to say. I mean, Eisenhower, he very much. Well, I'll put it this way. On the one hand, he's taking on conventional weapons. I mean, part of his whole, the New Look defense posture was sort of, reducing expenditures on conventional weapons, but increasing expenditures on nuclear weapons. And then not only increasing spending on them and creating them, but openly talking about using them, which he did frequently. He was once asked in a press conference, would he ever consider using them? And he compared it to a bullet in a gun. It's just like any other ammunition. Of course you use it. Now, privately, he had no such desires to use it. But I think it shows his sophistication on defense issues. It's not just that he was skeptical of the military, although in many ways he was. It's that he was trying to sort of transform the military and try to transform the way the military saw the world. Eisenhower understood that the days of having the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of the Bulge were over. That you're never going to have these massive conventional armies firing guns at each other. You're going to have nuclear exchanges. The whole game has changed. And a lot of people didn't realize that in the 50s. Many people in the military, or at least they resisted it. Eisenhower understood that. And so it's hard to say, where his thinking on the issue would evolve to today, because he was evolving quite a bit during his lifetime. He did publicly say that preventative war was not something that he thought was a good idea. But again, 50 years ago, things looked different as well. The issues were different. You had, a two-polar world. So it's just hard to say. And I try to be very careful about speaking for Eisenhower, because I just feel so unqualified to speak to what he would think. What he would think today. I can only tell you what he thought then, which is that the military needs to be transformed, and we need to think of the world as a very scary place with nuclear weapons, and we're not going to have large-scale land battles with conventional weapons anymore, which he was right about.
I've heard that Eisenhower did not have the greatest rapport with Truman. You made just a brief comment about Truman's executive order, but how would you describe the fact of him being the successor of Truman in shaping the man he was?
Again, it's another interesting relationship that deteriorated pretty rapidly. Truman was a big Eisenhower fan originally. Talked to him about actually stepping aside and letting him run in 48 as the Democratic candidate. Eisenhower refused. That was sort of the high point. It was kind of all downhill after that. Once Eisenhower officially became a Republican, or officially announced he was a Republican, Truman sent him a pretty terse letter after Eisenhower had announced he was going to resign from NATO and come back to the States and run. And then in the 52 campaign, it was just brutal. They were just... I know we think that campaigns are really ugly today, and they are, but campaigns have always been ugly in America. And, 52, they were just, knocking each other around every day. Truman was talking about, Eisenhower and being sympathetic to Nazis, and Eisenhower was saying that, Truman was, it was a great line, it's in the book, that Truman was too long in office and too big for his britches, and they were just sort of going back and forth, and when they had the transition meeting on January 20th, 1953, as you know, by tradition, the incoming president and the outgoing president meet at the White House, go inside, have coffee, then they go to the inauguration. Well, they didn't go inside. Eisenhower pulled up in the car, and Truman got in, and they went straight to the inauguration. So I think in later years it improved a bit, but Truman and Eisenhower, again, it's another fascinating deterioration of a relationship, and it's in the book.
We have time for one more question before we go to the book signing, and I believe this gentleman here, you have a question?
Yes, regarding his so-called temper, I've read a lot about it. Did you ever experience, or is it true?
He did have a temper. It was largely under control. I mean, I think it's been quite exaggerated, the extent to which it would show up. And it usually would show up, I think, revealingly, when a big issue was at stake. Or when he didn't think someone really realized what was at stake. And I'll give you an example that's in the book. Art Larson, one of his speechwriters, went in to meet with him one day, and Eisenhower had just met with an Army 3-star, and it was the day after. Remember the Navy, the Vanguard was the early sort of missile system they were trying to say, and it failed, and it was big news in the papers that it hadn't worked. So Art Larson goes in as the general comes out, and Eisenhower is just red-faced, and Larson asked him, how'd your meeting with the general go? And he says, well, we were talking about the Navy's missile system failing, and do you want to know what that 3-star said to me? He said it was a great day for the Army. And Larson could tell by Eisenhower's red complexion that he had just ripped the guy up and down when he said that. As he should, because the Army general had sort of lost sight of the big picture. He also had strict doctor's orders to be very careful with his temper. But I don't find that it was extraordinary or was excessive or it was even that often. It was just every once in a while he would sort of assert his anger that people sort of didn't see things the way they should, or they hadn't done something they shouldn't have done, and I think that's entirely appropriate for a guy leading huge operations, including the leader of the free world. I think I kind of want a president that kind of calls people to task occasionally.
Please join me in thanking Kasey Pipes for his time tonight and his thoughtful book.
Thanks.
Good job.